Annie and I had a wonderful trip to Ireland, where, believe it or not, we saw a lot of sheep grazing, colorful as a result of the identifying paint on their wool. Illustration. Let's see, does this work? We spent our first few days in Dingle, County Kerry, and it's just about the westernmost part of both Ireland and Europe. And if we had been counting sheep, the numbers would be in the thousands, yet not one shepherd was evident. Little known fact, there are more sheep, 5.2 million, than people, 4.8 million in Ireland. Anybody remember the St. Louis Jesuits song, Like a Shepherd? If I was Joan Aspen, I could hum a few lines, but I am not. And as I understand, we have some musical challenges here. But, you know, the words, he feeds his flock and gathers the lambs in his arms, holding them carefully close to his heart, leading us home. It's a great image, right? So let's see a show of hands for those of us who grew up with images of the Good Shepherd. Yeah, it's a beloved image. And how often, you know, either in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 20s, whatever decade you want, how often was the Good Shepherd depicted as a woman? Not so much. Anyway, when I was ordained, notably, 8 years ago, last Tuesday, that's right. And some of you were here, and some of you I had never met. But when that happened, Charlotte gave me a beautiful picture of a female shepherd as a gift that I treasure. Little known fact, in the Middle East, in Jesus's time, shepherds were culturally, most often, young women, young girls, unless a family had no daughters, in which case then it would typically be the youngest son, as in the case of David. We remember him, right? Funny what we learn. So in 2023, it feels to me, at least, as if the sheep shepherd metaphor has, I'm going to say, and my intention is not to offend anyone, but I feel like it's past its expiration date, because it reinforces a hierarchical relationship between us as the humans and the divine, and implies that humans are timid and unthinking and docile. Even more troublesome, for me anyway, the metaphor reinforces the perspective of bishops who position themselves as shepherds and expect people to follow their lead without question. 3 more little known facts. Sheep are really intelligent animals. They're social creatures, and they have great memories. Number 2, baby lambs recognize their mothers, both visually because they've got great eyesight, as well as audibly. They recognize the bleating as a way to communicate. And number 3, and when I do my research, this one surprised me. Some sheep are even gay. Oh. Up to 8% of male sheep prefer males, even when fertile females are around. Curious. But enough about the facts. Today's gospel introduces the idea of a threshold, a door, or a gate that provides safety, protection, and care. The shepherd's voice resonates with the sheep, each being called by name. But for context, understand what comes before this in the New Testament. This was the beginning of the 10th chapter of the Gospel of John. In the 9th, the story is when Jesus healed the blind man on the Sabbath. And the religious leaders were not happy because that was against the law. And so the references about thieves and robbers and marauders that were in our gospel today, what are we talking about? But if we understand that Jesus is addressing the scribes and the Pharisees, those who selfishly consider themselves better than and a cut above the general population of Israelites, for me, it's easier to understand the context. Jesus is indicting the leaders of the community for their hypocrisy and deceit and black and white interpretation of the world. See how far we've come? We don't have to look too far to see today's iterations in our world and in our church, and maybe even in us, as violence and nationalism and inflation continue to rise, and as any group that is seen as different is excluded and labeled dangerous, rather than being welcomed and treated as equals. You know, when you travel, especially internationally, it takes a little while to get back in the groove when you get back. The older I get, the longer it takes. While we were in Ireland on the 17th of April, a conference was held at Georgetown University, and it was entitled Faith, Feminism, and Being Unfinished: The Question of Women's Ordination. It was sponsored by a number of groups at Georgetown: Georgetown's Women's Center, the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, the Office of Mission and Ministry, the Georgetown Women's Alliance, the Gender Plus Justice Initiative, and the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. So I finally this week had a chance to watch the video from that session. And they had a number of panelists, and comments from two of the panelists really stayed with me. They were answering the question, what would be your number one priority in terms of unfinished items in the church? Like, what would you do? And the first of those two people I want to highlight was feminist theologian Mary Hunt, whose response was structural change, shifting from the pyramid model to what she described as a pinwheel, right? Remember pinwheels, right? Where there was a center that was anchored in love and the Spirit, and where breath generates movement, and the different colored parts of the pinwheel go around. The second thing that stayed with me was a comment that Alice McDermott, award-winning author. Anybody read anything that Alice has written? Alice suggested that a universal synod focused on hypocrisy, a word Jesus often used, would be what she would recommend as really a way to jumpstart the process of structural change. As I reflected on all that and this weekend's readings, I realized we are best served by releasing what no longer serves us and focusing on what does energize us. So on this day, when Catholic churches throughout the world appeal and pray for vocations to the male priesthood, here at Mary Magdalene, we recognize vocation in the broader and truer sense, that each of us discover and pursue what we are best suited for, and have the courage to practice what makes us whole. As resurrection people, it's our responsibility to ground ourselves in love and compassion, and proclaim with our lives that Jesus's vision of love and justice continues to rise in us. Remember the invitation that we heard Fran read this morning in the second reading. That invited us to recognize the divine revealed in our world through us, and to be the ones that we've been waiting for, prophetic, poetic myth makers, conspiring in the evolution of a conscious culture. In the process, we shepherd each other. My friends, the invitation today is to practice resurrection. God bless us all.